We're recruiting goblins and wielding molar spikes. That's right, it's Grimpath from Deck Tactics. In this tough and tactical TCG, two players each take control of warlords, commanding a band of powerful minions and influences over the battlefield. Over a series of rounds, they'll recruit and rally allies, cast spells, and produce relics. The first player to lower the opposing warlord's health to 0 wins the game. Setup begins with battlefield creation. Each player sets their deck of 30 cards, including one warlord next to their side of the board, or player mats, or terrain depending on how far down the Kickstarter rabbit hole you choose to go. Players also set their miniatures matching their deck's minions along their side. The area in between the player and the board is known as their barracks, divided into 2 rows. The Warlord card is placed in the row closest to the board. This is where minions will go as well. The second row is for influence cards. Next, players roll initiative by each rolling a d10. The player with the higher roll chooses who goes first. Players then take turns placing terrain on their side of the battlefield equal to their initiative roll. Once all have been placed, players set 2 d10s equal to their warlord's health and place their warlords on their starting lines, the line closest to their side. Finally, each player draws a starting hand of 7 cards. Each player gets 1 mulligan option. They can discard their entire hand back to their deck, give it a shuffle, and draw a new hand. Before we jump into gameplay, let's look at the cards. With the exception of the Warlords card, they come in 4 types. Minions, the monsters, villains, and heroes aiding the Warlord on the battlefield. Minion cards have a name, influence cost, including specific influence of certain spheres and sometimes of any sphere, power, which is the amount of influence they can provide to the player when in play, type and subtype, abilities, toughness, which can also be used to counter-attack, and health, which keeps them alive. Lose it all, and they die. When recruited, their miniature may be added to the battlefield, either on a space in the player's starting line or adjacent to the warlord. Next up, action cards. Action cards are one-time use events. They come in 3 types: spells, feats, and initiatives. They have a cost and effect, after which they're discarded. Spells and feats can be cast on a player's tactics phase of their turn, while initiatives can be cast at any time and resolve immediately. Influences, which provide the power to recruit minions. These can be played once per turn and each provide 1 unit of a specific sphere of influence. Additionally, they may be exhausted, turned sideways, to activate their effect. All exhausted cards are returned to their ready state at the start of a new turn. And finally, relics, which are magical items which minions or warlords may use during combat. Gameplay occurs in turns, each divided into 4 phases: start of turn, tactics, combat, and end of turn. First, in the start of turn phase, the active player readies any exhausted cards they control by turning them back to their original orientation. They then draw 1 card from the top of their deck and put it into their personal hand. This card draw is skipped on the first player's first turn to mitigate first turn advantage. Next, in the tactics phase, the active player can gain influence, recruit or rally minions, and move their combatants around on the battlefield. When gaining influence, the player may place 1 influence card from their hand into the first row of their barracks area. This is a cost-free ability. Then these cards can be exhausted for either 1 influence of their type or their ability. When gaining influence, it must be used in the phase it was accessed, otherwise it's lost. When recruiting minions, the player pays the influence cost of the minion and adds its card to the upper area of their barracks, along with their corresponding miniature, to the board. They can be placed either along the starting row, as mentioned earlier, or to a space adjacent to the warlord. Since minions have a health value, set a d6 nearby to track it. One important note: on their first turn in play, recruited minions are unable to act. That means they can't use actions, move, or attack. After their first turn, though, they're ready to rock. Rally a minion is a sweet mechanic in Grimpath which allows you to access more influence even if a player lacks influence cards in their hand. A player can set a minion card into their influence row, effectively not into the battle, but cheering on the warlord from the sidelines, you know? When played this way, the miniature is not added to the map and all text on the card is ignored for now. Instead, the rallied minion can be exhausted like any influence card to provide one influence of their type to the player. Note that rallied minions can be recruited to the battlefield from this space just as if they had been in your hand. Finally, movement, which can come from influence cards, or the player can spend one influence to move one unit, one adjacent space orthogonally. Before we move on to combat, let's look at the board. The battlefield is made up of a 10 by 10 grid of spaces, each known as a step. Terrain blocks take up one step and block line of sight. A unit can traverse the terrain only if it's adjacent and only one level above or below their current position. Moving up one space is free, but each additional movement must be paid for with influence. Line of sight, which is important for some ranged effects, occurs when a player can draw an imaginary line from a corner of their mini's current space to two corners in the space of their target, like in this handy example from the demo rules. Units are within melee range of each other if they're adjacent and one or less levels above or below their target. Lastly, if a mini wants to drop off high ground and not pay the influence, they take fall damage, 1 damage per unit of terrain off which they fell. Once the player has resolved all their desired tactics, play moves to their combat phase, which is divided into 3 steps: attacker start step, defender step, damage, and end of combat step. First up in the attacker start step, the player exhausts one minion or warlord and declares which target they are attacking. Players may cast initiatives or activate abilities before blockers are declared. Grimpath uses a stack mechanic. All abilities and actions activated at the same time go into a stack, where they are resolved one at a time from last played to first played. Next, in the defender step, the defending player chooses if they will counterattack or block. A targeted miniature can counterattack if it's readied. The player exhausts it, and it will deal its toughness value in damage to the attacker. A different miniature than the one targeted can instead block the attack. If they're adjacent, the target and the blocker can switch spaces, and the blocker now becomes the target. In either case, players may again cast initiatives or activate abilities before damage is resolved. Finally, in the damage and end of combat step, both units deal damage at the same time. The defender only deals damage if they counterattacked. Track damage on the die associated with the unit. If they hit 0 health, they are removed from the battlefield and their card is discarded. After combat is resolved, the players return to their tactic phase. They can resolve any tactical effects and then re-enter the combat phase for another activation. This continues until the active player is out of readied units or they choose to pass. Then, in the end of turn step, the player resolves end of turn effects and play passes to the next player. And that's the turn structure. Some other important concepts for Grimpath: opportunity attacks. Whenever an enemy unit moves out of melee range of a ready minion, that minion has the option to enter a free combat phase against that specific enemy, which means this occurs on the opponent's turn. Relics. These powerful items interplay attached to a unit and can be exhausted for their ability or used to attack with that unit. Whenever a minion holding a relic dies, it's dropped onto the space where the unit died. Set a trinket there to mark its location and move the card out of the barracks. These can be picked up by paying their pickup cost on a future turn. A player can only pick up their own relics, not their opponents. And that's the basics of Grimpath. I'm Becca Scott. This is Good Time Society's local dungeon, and if you want to be locked in here too with these comfy shackles, lovely lantern, and We got some foliage for oxygen. All you have to do is hit subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and maybe leave a sweet little comment below. Then come on back for more great games and good times. Bye-bye.